Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I must say this is an amazing way to bring us out. I feel a little bit like Lady Gaga beginning a concert. And my daughter has come with me to Puebla, and we both really appreciated the hospitality of all of you here. Now, I'm going to talk about resetting the impossible in terms of addressing so many of the global issues that seem insurmountable, whether they be global poverty, global conflict, in terms of a strategy of focusing on making women catalysts of change. And I think people are always a little bit surprised that a man and a New York Times columnist should be talking about focusing on educating girls, bringing women out of the mainstream. And let me tell you how that came about. The expression half the sky, that women hold up half the sky, comes from a Chinese expression. And the idea for this really originated when my wife and I were in China. That's my wife, Cheryl, and there we are in Tiananmen Square a few months ago. I'm just checking if you're paying attention. One way of gauging that is that my oldest son is on my shoulders there, and he is now in college. So it sort of underscores how quickly kids will grow in just a few months. But when Cheryl and I were in China, then we noticed, for the first time, we went out to a village in the middle of China in Hubei province in a rural area. It is the Dabia Mountains. And we were writing about how there were so many girls who were dropping out of school because they were girls. And we chose as the person to make this a larger story, this girl here. Her name is Dai Manju. She was the brightest kid in school. She was a 6th grader, and she'd had to drop out of school for lack of $13 in school fees. So we wrote an article for the front page of the New York Times about how this incredibly bright girl had to drop out because of a want of $13. And her picture was there across 3 columns on the front page. You can maybe imagine what happened. Readers of the New York Times then just deluged us with letters and checks, mostly for $13 to help her. New York Times readers are just extraordinarily generous in these, very modest increments. But we also got a wire transfer of $10,000 to help her. We took all this money down. We worked out a deal with the head of the school, who is that man there beside her, whereby girls in this community would be able to stay in school and would not have to pay school fees as long as they could maintain the grade. Those girls were thrilled. We called up the donor of the $10,000 to give him a report. He seemed kind of surprised that we should call him up. But we explained that he'd had this unbelievable impact on this community. He seemed even more surprised, and we said, "You just don't understand how far $10,000 will go in rural China." He kind of gasped and said, $10,000? I only sent $100. That was our turn to gasp. It turned out, indeed, that he had only wired $100. But the bank had a little trouble with that decimal point. We figured the banker in charge was later put in charge of subprime mortgages, you figure? So we didn't know what to do. We couldn't imagine going back to these girls and saying, "Oh, sorry, it's all a mistake." So I'm a little embarrassed about what I did. I called up the bank, the chief spokesman for the bank, and I explained exactly what had happened. They'd made this error. These girls were counting on it. Then I just sort of let slip the fact that I was working on a follow-up article. And I said, "Now, On the record, are you planning to try to get that $9,900 back and force all these girls to drop out of school? He didn't miss a beat. He said, on the record, under the circumstances, we're delighted to make a donation of the difference. Well, it was fascinating to watch what happened as a result. That was back in 1990. It's been 21 years. We've gone back to this village regularly. And now, make no mistake, all of China has gotten richer and better educated since then. But this village has truly been transformed. Dai Manju herself became the first person in her family to graduate from elementary school, from high school, then went on and earned an accounting degree, became an accountant, sent money back to her community that was used to start businesses. And so many other girls who otherwise would have been working in the rice paddies or herding goats ended up getting a great job in ways that supported the entire community. And so now when you go back, you look at this village compared to those around it, and this one is far, way ahead economically and educationally of all those around it, all because of a one-time bank error 21 years ago. And it was because of episodes like that that led Cheryl and me increasingly to focus on using girls' education and then those educated women as a lever for change in societies. Part of it was that when we looked to try to explain the dynamism, the economic dynamism of China, one major episode, one major aspect of that seemed to be that they took these rural girls who were traditionally uneducated and had very low productivity, and through education, bringing them into good jobs in the labor force hugely expanded the output of the economy. It was this that ultimately led us to some of the themes that we pursued. The first is maybe the grimmer theme. And this has to do with many of the impossible challenges that we're trying to reset. We argue that just as in the 19th century, the central moral challenge for the world was slavery. In the 20th century, the central moral challenge for the world was totalitarianism. In this century, we argue, the paramount moral challenge is going to be the gender inequity that is the lot of so many women and girls around the world. Now, when we say that, I think people tend to think that that's meant as hyperbole. And to explain why it isn't hyperbole, let me turn the tables and ask you a question. Are there more males or females in the world today? Some difference here. Let me put it to a vote. If you think there are more males in the world today, can you raise your hand? And if you think there are more females in the world today, can you raise your hand? I'm actually afraid the first group was right. There are more males in the world today. There are more females in North America, more females in Europe. Given equal access to food and health care, women live longer. In an equitable world, there would be more females. But the problem is that food and health care are not administered equitably, and gender discrimination in much of the world is lethal. This is a picture I took in Ethiopia, an emergency feeding center. Looks like hunger, starvation, but what you need to know is that every kid in that feeding center was a girl. And this girl's brothers were doing just fine. The result of this kind of gender discrimination is that mortality rates for girls are much higher than for boys, particularly in Asia. And the result of that, and also of sex-selective abortion, is that you now have a surplus of males over females in the world today. But there's another theme, that putting aside the injustices, just looking at how we can go about bringing change in the world today, then there is now abundant evidence, growing evidence, that the best strategy is precisely to do what we saw in Hubei province in China, to educate girls, to bring those educated women into the labor force, into the same kind of a virtuous spiral of development as happened in that village. To put it another way, women and girls aren't the problem, they're the solution. There are a few reasons for that. If you educate a boy, then he will, on balance, have fewer children, but it's a marginal impact. You educate a girl, and she will have dramatically fewer children. And that addresses population issues that are so crucial to so many aspects of development. Another has to do with an area of research that, if you're a man, is frankly utterly embarrassing to go through. It is that when you look at spending patterns, that when women get control of the purse strings and earn money and spend it, then the money is much more likely to go to generate, to support children, to support children's education, to start small businesses. Well, we men are pretty good at getting income and spending it on beer. And if you look worldwide at how money is spent for people earning less than $1 per day, then the numbers are fuzzy, but as an order of magnitude, it looks as if about 2% of incomes go toward education, which is a great investment, and 20%, 10 times as much, goes toward a combination of alcohol, tobacco, prostitution, sugary drinks, and very extravagant festivals. And that is because men are controlling the purse strings. We see growing evidence that when women control that income, you see much more money going toward education. And finally, there is some evidence that when you bring women into the mainstream of societies, that you have somewhat less civil conflict, although that research is still ongoing. Now, if this is the case, then what might an agenda look like? I'm just back from Cambodia. I just got back a couple of days ago, and so maybe one issue on my mind is human trafficking, sex trafficking around the world. Cambodia is one of the worst places for this. This is a brothel in Cambodia. These girls were kidnapped in villages. They're locked up in the brothel. It really is modern slavery. And one difference from traditional slavery is the scale. The peak of transatlantic slavery was the 1780s, when just under 80,000 Africans were transported a year to the New World, just under 80,000. These days, the best estimates seem to be that about 800,000 people are trafficked across international borders each year. In Cambodia a few days ago, I participated in a raid on a brothel run by the military, the Cambodian military. There was a 12-year-old Vietnamese girl who'd been trafficked into that brothel. She had 20 customers a night. She was locked up there. She was, in every sense, a slave. And one of the things that I did that raised a lot of eyebrows in the journalistic community was that in 2004, I ended up buying 2 girls from their brothels. One was this girl, Sreenet, paid $150 for her, and then $200 for Sreemom, the one in the white blouse with the blue line. I bought human beings. Then we took them back to their families, started them in small businesses. It's a long story. But maybe the thing that troubled me the most was that I got receipts from the brothels. When you buy a human being and get a receipt in the 21st century, that really is a disgrace on us all, I think. If we look about how to bring about change, then there's no silver bullet. Nothing works perfectly. But maybe education and especially educating girls, has a better record than almost anything else. And it has particularly troubled me that the United States and Afghanistan and Pakistan has been so willing to spend money on military solutions that, frankly, have not proven terribly effective, and quite reluctant to invest in education, which over time tends to have a rather better record of subduing civil conflict and violence and creating avenues for economic development. This is a girl in Uganda near the Congo border. Her name is Beatrice Bira, and she was not sent to school by her parents because she was a girl. Her parents thought, well, you know, she can look after her younger siblings, she can fetch water, fetch firewood. And then there's a group that I bet a lot of you know called Heifer International. They give goats, other animals as a way of generating income, and that family passes it on. So a church in the U.S. in Connecticut bought 6 goats. One of those goats ended up in Beatrice's family. They sold the milk from that goat, and they had a little more income, and they used that income to send Beatrice to school. She turned out to be just a brilliant student. She rocketed to the top of her class. She was 9 years old. All the other first graders were 6, but she worked really hard. She was at the top of her class. In middle school and in high school, she began to do very well in the nationwide exams. Soon she became the first person in her village to go abroad to study. And then a couple of years ago, she graduated from Connecticut College. And that's her at her graduation. Isn't that awesome? That truly is, you know, resetting the impossible through education. And Beatrice, at that graduation party, she pronounced herself the luckiest girl in the world and said, "It's all because of a goat." Now, I think there are some skeptical questions that people often have. And one is the question of whether these kinds of interventions really make a difference. I think that there are a lot of people who would like to try to reset the impossible in other people's lives, but they're skeptical, they're wary of corruption, of the ineffectiveness of aid organizations, of whether these strategies are just too modest to really make a difference. Those are fair questions. Corruption is a real problem, as you know, in much of the world. In Chad, in northern Africa, there was one study that found that for every dollar that was intended for rural health clinics, only 3 cents actually reached those clinics. Anybody who has traveled around has seen lots of well-intentioned projects that just ended up collapsing. Somebody built a well, and it worked fine for 6 months, but then a part in the well broke. There was no way of providing a replacement part, and all the investment was lost. But anybody who has traveled has also seen these projects and interventions that have made a tremendous difference, like educating Beatrice. And I think we're also getting smarter about what kinds of interventions work. And I should say that some of the best evidence about what works has come from Mexico's Oportunidades program, which, because it has been introduced so rigorously, has really provided very good evidence about how to make a difference. In education, for example, we're learning that it's not just about building schools, but it's about little things that we never tend to think of, like deworming a child. You can deworm a child for a tiny fraction of a dollar, one pill every 6 months or every year, and it will reduce by 25% the absenteeism, which tends to be very high in African schools. We're learning that one reason why high school girls drop out of school is something that, because it's a taboo, we never think of, which is difficulties managing menstruation. So some projects have shown that just handing out sanitary pads will dramatically reduce absenteeism. And finally, there's the question of, are these problems just too big to solve? And let me leave you with a story. This is a parable from Hawaii that is so kind of hokey that I'm almost embarrassed to share it at a distinguished conference like this. But it really speaks to me because I've seen the way, even though these problems of illiteracy or conflict seem so vast, and obviously we're not going to solve them here, but one can at the margins make a real difference that transform people's lives. And so this story goes that a boy is walking along the beach, and all these starfish have washed up, and the boy is frantically trying to throw them back into the sea. And a man comes up and says, "What are you doing? There are millions of starfish that have washed up. You can't make a difference." And the boy just reaches down and throws another one back in the sea and says, "Well, sure made a difference to that one." Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.